The sun blazed mercilessly over the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, Texas. In the summer of 1882, heat waves shimmered off the weathered wooden planks of the boardwalk, and the saloon doors creaked in the lazy afternoon breeze. At the far end of town, near the cattle pens, a group of young cowboys gathered around the water trough, their horses snorting and stamping in the shade. Jake Morrison, barely 19 with sun-bleached hair and calloused hands, dipped his hat into the cool water and poured it over his head. The other ranch hands laughed and joked, but their voices carried an edge of tension that had become all too familiar in recent weeks. "Riders coming in," called out Tommy Wells, the youngest of the group at 17. He pointed toward the horizon, where dust clouds marked the approach of several horsemen. The laughter died instantly. Every man present knew those silhouettes. Broad-shouldered figures riding with the swagger of men who believed themselves untouchable. Black Pete Garrison and his gang of cutthroats had been terrorizing the area for months, demanding protection money from ranchers and beating anyone who dared refuse. "Maybe we should head back to the ranch," whispered Charlie Evans, nervously adjusting his hat. At 22, he was one of the older hands, but fear had a way of making even grown men feel small. Jake straightened his shoulders and remained by the trough. "This is a public watering hole. We got as much right to be here as anybody." The approaching riders numbered 5, their leader easily recognizable by his black hat and the cruel smile that never seemed to leave his weathered face. Black Pete had earned his nickname not from his appearance, but from the darkness that seemed to follow wherever he went. Behind him rode his usual companions, men whose names were whispered in saloons and whose faces appeared on wanted posters. In every sheriff's office within 100 miles, the horses thundered to a stop just yards from the young cowboys, kicking up a cloud of dust that made several of the men cough and step backward. Black Pete remained mounted, looking down at the group with obvious contempt. "Well, well," Pete drawled, his voice carrying the hint of a southern accent. "If it ain't the baby cowboys, playing dress-up in their daddy's clothes." His men chuckled at the insult, their hands resting casually on their gun belts. Jake noticed how they spread out slightly, a practiced formation that spoke of many confrontations and few survivors who could testify against them. "We ain't looking for trouble," Charlie said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Course you ain't," Pete replied, swinging down from his horse with fluid grace. "But trouble's got a way of finding folks, don't it, boys?" The other outlaws dismounted, their spurs jingling ominously as they approached. Jake counted the odds, 5 armed men against 6 cowboys, but most of his companions were already backing away. The math wasn't encouraging. "You boys been working mighty hard," Pete continued, pulling out a tobacco pouch and beginning to roll a cigarette. "Driving cattle, mending fences, earning your keep. That's honest work, and honest work deserves honest pay." He lit the cigarette and took a long drag, letting the smoke curl around his words. "Problem is, honest pay attracts dishonest attention. Lot of dangerous folks out there who might take a notion to relieve you of your wages." Tommy Wells shifted nervously. "We ain't got much money, mister." "Oh, I know exactly what you got," Pete smiled, and the expression was colder than a January wind. "Been watching you boys collect your pay every Friday, $1.50 a day, plus meals. Not much, but it adds up over time." Jake felt his jaw tighten. They'd been watched, studied like cattle being evaluated for slaughter. The realization that their every movement had been catalogued made his skin crawl. "What do you want?" Jake asked, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. Black Pete's eyes locked onto his, and Jake saw something there that made his blood run cold, a complete absence of human mercy. "Smart boy asks smart questions," Pete said. "What I want is simple, protection money. Say half your wages each week, and we make sure nothing unfortunate happens to you or your families." The demand hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. The silence that followed Black. Pete's demand stretched like a taut rope ready to snap. Jake could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, mixing with the distant lowing of cattle and the creak of leather as the outlaws shifted their weight. Half their wages meant the difference between survival and starvation for most of these young men, many of whom were sending money back to families struggling on hardscrabble farms. Charlie Evans was the first to break. We don't got that kind of money to spare, mister. Most of us are barely scraping by as it is." Black Pete's laugh was like the rattle of bones in a coffin. "Barely scraping by?" He gestured broadly at the town around them. "You got jobs, you got food, you got roofs over your heads. That's more than a lot of folks can say these days." Tommy Wells took a step backward, his face pale beneath his hat brim. My ma's counting on the money I send home. She's got 3 little ones to feed since Pa died. That's real touching, boy, Pete said, flicking ash from his cigarette. But dead men don't send money home at all. You'd do well to remember that. The threat was clear as mountain air. Jake watched as his companions' faces reflected the same calculation he was making. Give up half their wages or risk losing everything, including their lives. It was the kind of choice that had no good answer. The kind that broke men's spirits long before it broke their bodies. You're asking us to choose between starving our families or getting shot, Jake said, his voice carrying further than he'd intended. Several townspeople had stopped to watch from a safe distance, their faces reflecting the same fear that had become as common as dust in Cedar Ridge. Black Pete's expression shifted, and Jake realized he'd made a mistake. The outlaw's eyes narrowed, and his hand moved closer to his gun. I ain't asking nothing, boy. I'm telling you how things are going to be. You can pay willing like, or you can pay after we've made examples of a few folks. Either way, you're going to pay. One of Pete's men, a scarred individual with a missing front tooth, spat into the dust. Maybe we should start with this mouthy one, Pete. Show the others we ain't playing games. Jake felt the familiar weight of his father's old Colt revolver against his hip. The weapon had been with him since he'd left home 3 years ago, but he'd never drawn it in anger. Target practice and hunting were one thing. Facing down armed killers was something else entirely. Now, Scar, Pete said, using what was apparently the man's nickname. No need to get hasty. These boys just need some time to think it over. He turned back to Jake and his companions. Tell you what, I'm feeling generous today. You got until sundown Friday to make your first payment. That gives you 2 days to get your affairs in order. The deadline was impossible. Friday was payday, but even then, handing over half their wages would leave most of them unable to pay for food or lodging, let alone send money to family. And if we refuse? The question came from Sam Rodriguez, a quiet Mexican cowboy who rarely spoke, but whose steady presence had always been reassuring. Now his dark eyes held a dangerous glint. Black Pete's smile returned, and it was the most frightening thing Jake had ever seen. Well now, Sam, I know your name, boy, and I know where your sister lives with her 3 babies. You really want to ask that question? Sam's face went white beneath his tan. The specific threat, the knowledge of personal details, drove home just how thoroughly they'd been watched and studied. These weren't random bandits making opportunistic demands. This was a calculated campaign of terror. You leave families out of this, Jake said, stepping forward, despite every instinct telling him to run. This is between you and us. Everything's connected, boy, Pete replied, dropping his cigarette and grinding it under his boot heel. You work for the ranchers got families, the families got friends. It's all one big web, and I'm the spider sitting right in the middle of it. The metaphor sent chills down Jake's spine. He looked around at his companions and saw his own fear reflected in their faces, but also something else. A growing anger that was starting to overcome their terror. 2 days, Pete repeated, swinging back onto his horse. Sundown Friday. Don't make me come looking for you boys, because if I do, I won't be nearly as friendly as I've been today. The outlaws mounted up and rode off toward the saloon, leaving the young cowboys standing in the dust, each man wrestling with an impossible choice that would define the rest of their lives. The remainder of Wednesday passed like a fever dream. Jake and his companions rode back to the Double Bar Ranch in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts about Black Pete's ultimatum. The familiar routine of evening chores, feeding horses, checking cattle, mending equipment, felt hollow and meaningless against the backdrop of their impossible situation. That night in the bunkhouse, the usual card games and storytelling gave way to hushed conversations and worried glances. Jake lay on his narrow cot, staring at the rough wooden ceiling and listening to the restless movements of men who couldn't sleep. Every creak of the building, every night sound from outside seemed to carry the promise of violence. Thursday morning brought no relief. Word of Black Pete's demands had spread through the ranch like wildfire, and even the older hands who'd been through Indian raids and cattle stampedes wore expressions of barely controlled fear. Ranch foreman Bill Hartley, a grizzled veteran of the Civil War, called the young cowboys aside after breakfast. "Boys," he said, his weathered face grave, "I heard what happened in town yesterday. I wish I could say the boss would back you up with extra guns or protection money, but times are tight. The ranch is barely breaking even as it is. Charlie Evans kicked at the dirt with his boot. So we're on our own? Afraid so, Hartley replied. But I will say this. Any man who decides to light out for safer territory won't get any argument from me. Sometimes discretion is the better part of valor. The offer to leave hung in the air, tempting as cool water on a hot day. Jake could see several of his companions considering it seriously. Tommy Wells was barely 17. He had his whole life ahead of him. Sam Rodriguez had family responsibilities that went beyond his own survival. Even Charlie Evans, for all his nervous energy, was a good man who deserved better than to be caught between outlaws and starvation. But something in Jake's chest burned at the thought of running. His father had died defending their small farm in Kansas against claim jumpers, and his mother had raised him with stories of men who stood up for what was right, even when it cost them everything. The idea of letting Black Pete and his gang terrorize innocent people while he fled to safety felt like betraying everything he'd been taught to believe in. Thursday evening brought an unexpected visitor to the ranch. Sheriff Tom Bradley rode in just as the sun was setting, his badge catching the last rays of golden light. Jake had seen the lawman around town, but had never spoken to him directly. Bradley was a thin man in his 50s, with steel-grey hair and eyes that had seen too much violence for one lifetime. "Heard you boys had some trouble in town," Bradley said, dismounting stiffly from his horse. "Wanted to talk to you about Black Pete and his gang." The cowboys gathered around the sheriff, hope flickering in their faces for the first time in 2 days. If the law was willing to get involved, maybe they wouldn't have to face this alone. "Sheriff," Jake said, "Pete gave us until Friday sundown to pay him half our wages or face the consequences. We're hoping you might have some advice." Bradley's expression darkened. "I got advice, all right, but you're not going to like it. Pete Garrison is wanted in 3 territories for robbery, murder, and worse. He's got 5 men riding with him, all of them killers. I'm 1 man with a badge and a 6-shooter, and the nearest federal marshal is 2 weeks' ride away." The hope that had begun to bloom in Jake's chest withered and died. "So you can't help us?" "I can't protect you," Bradley said bluntly. "But I can tell you that paying him won't make this end. Men like Pete don't take their money and ride away satisfied. They see weakness, and they exploit it until there's nothing left to take." Sam Rodriguez stepped forward. "Then what do you suggest we do, Sheriff?" Bradley was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening horizon. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Sometimes a man has to decide what he's willing to die for, and sometimes, if he's lucky and brave and skilled enough, he finds out what he's willing to live for too. The cryptic advice left the young cowboys more confused than enlightened, but there was something in the sheriff's tone that suggested he was telling them more than his badge allowed him to say directly. Friday morning dawned clear and hot, with the kind of blue sky that promised another scorching day. Jake woke before dawn and walked out to the corral, where his horse nickered softly in recognition. He'd made his decision sometime during the long, sleepless night, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly when the certainty had crystallized in his mind. He wasn't going to run, and he wasn't going to pay. Whatever happened at sundown, he was going to face it standing up. Friday afternoon arrived with the weight of inevitability. Jake had spent the day going through the motions of ranch work, but his mind was focused on the approaching confrontation. He'd cleaned and loaded his father's Colt revolver 3 times, checked the cylinder mechanism, and practiced his draw in the privacy of the barn until his movements became smooth and automatic. Word had spread through Cedar Ridge that something was going to happen at sundown. Shopkeepers closed their doors early. Families hurried children inside, and the saloon fell unusually quiet despite the presence of Black Pete and his gang. The town held its breath like a man underwater, waiting to see if he would surface or drown. At 5 o'clock, Jake walked into town alone. He'd made it clear to his companions that this was his choice and his fight. Tommy Wells had taken Sheriff Bradley's advice and ridden out that morning, heading back to his family farm in Oklahoma. Charlie Evans and 2 others had pooled their money and bought train tickets to Colorado, hoping to find work in the mining camps where Black Pete's influence didn't reach. Only Sam Rodriguez had chosen to stay, and Jake had spent an hour convincing him to remain at the ranch. "This isn't about courage," Jake had told him. "It's about what each man can live with. You've got family depending on you. I don't." Now, as Jake's boots echoed on the wooden boardwalk, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. Fear was still there, coiled tight in his stomach like a rattlesnake, but it was manageable. He'd made his choice, and whatever happened next was out of his hands. The main street of Cedar Ridge stretched before him like a stage set for some grand performance. At the far end, near the saloon, he could see Black Pete and his 4 remaining men lounging in chairs they'd dragged onto the porch. They'd positioned themselves strategically, with clear lines of fire down the street and easy access to their horses. Jake stopped in front of the general store, roughly 100 yards from the saloon. The distance was far enough to make conversation difficult, but close enough for accurate shooting. He pulled out his pocket watch, a gift from his mother when he'd left home, and noted that it was 10 minutes before 6 o'clock. "You sure about this, son?" The voice belonged to Sheriff Bradley, who stepped out of the shadows cast by the store's awning. The lawman's face was grim, but there was something like respect in his eyes. "Sure as I can be about anything," Jake replied, surprised by how steady his own voice sounded. Bradley nodded slowly. "I can't officially help you, but I want you to know that whatever happens here today, there are witnesses. Good people who'll remember that one young man had the backbone to stand up when it mattered." The sheriff retreated into the store, but Jake could see him watching through the window. Looking around, he noticed other faces, peering from doorways and windows, townspeople, who'd been too afraid to speak up, but who were unwilling to miss what might be the most important moment in Cedar Ridge's history. At exactly 6 o'clock, Black Pete rose from his chair and walked to the edge of the saloon porch. His voice carried clearly down the empty street. Well, looks like we got ourselves one brave little cowboy. Where are your friends, boy? They leave you to face the music alone?" "This is between you and me," Jake called back. "Leave the others out of it." Pete's laughter was harsh and mocking. "You think you're some kind of hero? You think standing there with that old gun is going to make you into some legend folks will sing songs about?" Jake's hand moved instinctively toward his holster, but he forced himself to remain still. The time for talking was almost over, but not quite yet. "I think a man has to choose what kind of person he wants to be, and I choose not to let you terrorize innocent people anymore." "Terrorize?" Pete stepped down from the porch, his own hand resting casually on his gun butt. "Boy, you don't know what terror looks like yet, but you're about to learn." The outlaw began walking down the street, his boots kicking up small puffs of dust with each step. Behind him, his men spread out slightly, creating a semicircle of death that would be impossible to escape once the shooting started. Jake's mouth went dry as desert sand. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to apologize, to offer Pete whatever he wanted, if it would end this peacefully. But his father's voice echoed in his memory, speaking words from Jake's childhood. "Son, there comes a time in every man's life when he has to decide if he's going to stand up or lie down. The man who lies down can live a long time, but he never really lives at all." 50 yards, 40, 30. Black Pete's face was clearly visible now, and Jake could see the cold confidence in the killer's eyes. This was a man who'd faced down dozens of opponents and walked away from every encounter. He moved with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable with violence, someone who'd turned murder into an art form. 20 yards. The distance where accuracy became academic and survival became a matter of speed and nerve. "Last chance, boy," Pete called out, his hand now hovering just inches from his gun. "Walk away now, and I might let you live to see another sunrise." Jake's response was to adjust his stance slightly, feet spread shoulder-width apart, weight balanced on the balls of his feet. His right hand hung loose and ready at his side, fingers relaxed, but prepared to move faster than they'd ever moved before. The street fell silent, except for the whisper of wind through the eaves and the distant sound of someone's nervous breathing. Even the horses seemed to sense the tension, stamping restlessly and snorting through their nostrils. Then Black Pete went for his gun. Time seemed to slow to a crawl, each heartbeat stretching into eternity. Jake watched Black Pete's hand snake toward his holster with the fluid motion of a practiced killer, and somewhere in the depths of his mind, he realized he was about to die. Pete's reputation wasn't built on luck or bluffing. The man was genuinely fast, genuinely deadly, and genuinely without mercy. But something remarkable happened in that frozen moment between life and death. All of Jake's fear evaporated, replaced by a crystalline clarity he'd never experienced before. His father's old Colt seemed to leap into his hand of its own accord, the familiar weight and balance as natural as breathing. Hours of practice in the barn, years of hunting rabbits and target shooting, and a lifetime of his father's patient instruction all combined into one perfect moment of controlled violence. The two guns cleared leather almost simultaneously. But Jake's had the advantage of a hair's breadth, perhaps the difference between a man fighting for his life and a man who'd grown complacent with easy victories. Both weapons roared in the same instant, filling the street with thunder and smoke. Jake felt the wind of Pete's bullet pass so close to his ear that it singed the edge of his hat. His own shot took the outlaw center mass, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees in the dusty street. Pete's gun fell from nerveless fingers, and he looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt with something like surprise. "Well, I'll be damned," Pete whispered, then pitched forward, face first, into the dirt. For a moment, the street was absolutely silent. Then chaos erupted as Pete's four companions went for their guns, shouting curses and threats. Jake dove sideways behind a water trough as bullets whistled through the air where he'd been standing. Wood splinters and metal fragments flew as the outlaw's shots chewed up everything around his improvised cover. From his position behind the trough, Jake could see that he was in serious trouble. 4 armed men against 1, with limited ammunition and nowhere to run. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. He'd won the first exchange through skill and determination, but now he was about to die from simple numerical superiority. That's when Sheriff Bradley stepped out of the general store with a shotgun in his hands. "That's enough," the lawman shouted, his voice carrying the authority of years spent keeping the peace in violent frontier towns. "Black Pete Garrison is dead and his reign of terror is over. The rest of you have a choice. Ride out now and don't come back, or join your leader in the dirt." The remaining outlaws looked uncertain for the first time since Jake had known them. Their leader was dead, their aura of invincibility shattered by a 19-year-old cowboy with an old gun and more courage than sense. Scar, the scarred man who'd threatened Jake 2 days earlier, looked back and forth between the sheriff and his fallen leader. "You can't take all of us." "Lawman," Scar snarled, but there was doubt in his voice. "Maybe not," Bradley admitted. "But I can take at least 2 of you with me, and the boy behind that trough can probably account for another one. That leaves just 1 of you riding away, and he'll spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder." More faces appeared in windows and doorways as the townspeople of Cedar Ridge began to realize that their long nightmare might actually be ending. Jake could see storekeepers with hunting rifles, ranch hands with pistols, and even a few women holding kitchen knives. The entire community was finally ready to stand up for itself. The remaining outlaws seemed to sense the shift in momentum. Without their charismatic and deadly leader, they were just 4 scared men facing an entire town that had found its courage. One by one, they began backing toward their horses. "This ain't over," Scar warned, but his threat lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," Jake said, rising from behind the water trough with his gun still drawn. "It's over because good people finally decided to stop being afraid. It's over because sometimes one man standing up gives everyone else permission to do the same." The 4 surviving outlaws mounted their horses and rode hard out of town, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the body of their leader. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, an extraordinary thing happened. The people of Cedar Ridge began emerging from their hiding places, blinking in the late afternoon sun like creatures emerging from a long winter. Jake holstered his father's Colt and looked down at Black Pete's body. There was no satisfaction in the kill, no sense of triumph or glory. He'd taken a human life, and that weight would stay with him forever. But he'd also stood up when it mattered, and that meant something too. Sheriff Bradley walked over and placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "Son, I've seen a lot of brave men in my time, but what you did today was something special. You gave this town back its soul." As the sun set over Cedar Ridge, Texas, the people began to rebuild what fear had torn down. And somewhere in the distance, 4 frightened outlaws rode toward an uncertain future, carrying with them the knowledge that their time of easy predation was over. Jake Morrison had drawn his gun with murderous fury, but he'd also drawn a line in the sand that changed everything. Sometimes that's all it takes. One person willing to stand up and say no more. The legend of the young cowboy who faced down Black Pete Garrison would be told around campfires and in saloons for generations, but Jake himself would always remember it differently. Not as a moment of glory, but as the day he learned what he was willing to fight for and what he was willing to die for. In the end, that made all the difference.